So this event is tied to WWF's Earth Day campaign, which was all about the migratory monarch butterfly. And as you all know, and I'm sure celebrated, Earth Day was this past Saturday, April 22nd. But the migratory monarch butterfly has become an enduring symbol of nature's beauty and renewal. But sadly, the butterfly populations have drastically declined in the past 25 years. You know, when we think of animals losing their habitats, we usually think of pandas and tigers in faraway places, but monarch butterflies are losing their homes right here in our own backyard due to climate change and milkweed depletion. But everyone can help protect the endangered migratory monarch butterfly by planting milkweed pollinator gardens along the monarch route, and also attending events like these, helping to raise awareness and just educate yourself about these incredible species. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our guest today. I am joined by Monica Echeverria, WWF's Deputy Director of Media and External Affairs, and our communications lead here in the US on our Monarch work. Monica has had the chance to unveil the wonders of the butterflies world and share their uplifting story of WWF's work to protect them. Monica's work encompasses our Hispanic engagement communications through traditional and social media, and she promotes WWF's conservation work from our Latin American offices to US and Hispanic media. So thank you so much to Monica for joining us. And we're of course beyond thrilled to have Wendy Williams here with us today to talk about her book, The Language of Butterflies. Wendy is a journalist and author, and she has written for a number of publications, including the Boston Globe, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Christian Science Monitor, among others. And she is the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Horse. Her 3 most recent books emphasize the deep and essential connections between human beings and the rest of the natural world. And The Language of Butterflies explores the lives of the world's most beautiful and resilient animals and the roles they play in our ecosystem. Wendy is an animal lover, as are all of us, and is often pictured with her dog Taff, a border collie who has a Harvard degree, and he really does have one. And so, Wendy, I hope to hear that story. I hope we get to it today.
But I don't. That story.
Perfect. Well, I don't want to delay us any further. So, Monica, over to you.
Hi, Monica.
Hi. Hi, Wendy, and thank you, Jenna, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Talking to Wendy before has been really very, very exciting when I saw her book and I read her book, and I hope we can give you at least a glimpse of the amount of information that she found doing this research. And actually, Wendy, I would like to start by asking you about that. How did you decide to write about butterflies? I mean, I know they're beautiful. Many of us like them and love them, but I never thought about, I mean, such many people that you interview for this. Can you tell us more how the interest for you to write a book about butterflies started?
Monica, it was kind of an accident, really. I'm very interested in this book, as you know. I'm interested in rehabilitating land and how we can take land that's been ruined and revitalize it so that it can support all kinds of wildlife. One of the other animals I've written about before, as people know, is the horse. But in this case, I wanted to write about a tiny little being that we all take for granted. We've all looked at butterflies throughout our life, and maybe they'll flutter by and we'll go, "Oh, isn't that pretty?" And that's the end of it. So nothing more happens. You don't pursue that. So, I've had butterflies in my life basically since I was born, but I didn't know anything about them. And when I started digging into the subject of butterflies, I was amazed at how much we do know about them. Most of it, of course, in the last couple of decades. But I really wanted to talk to these scientists who are delving so deeply into all of these unique things. Plus, the story of the monarch butterfly is just an amazing, gobsmacking, breathtaking, unbelievable story that this being, with roots that trace back at least 130 million years, can be as far north as Canada and find its way, not just south, but all the way across the border towards Mexico City, then make a sharp right turn and head up into the mountains. That is amazing. Then they all gathered there. How does that work? How do they know that? How did they find that place? It's really unbelievable, but it's true. So I wanted to pursue that. And the more I pursued that, the more I found there were these other amazing, fascinating, unbelievable facts about butterflies that we just didn't know.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm from Mexico myself. Before I joined WWF, I heard about the monarch butterflies, but it was until really I understood about them when I started working in WWF about, how impressive this migration is from many, many ways.
Amazing. It shouldn't be able to happen, right? It doesn't make any sense. There's no logic to it. How did this evolve? It's just not logical. And yet it happens. So how does it happen? That's what I really wanted to know. And when I contacted scientists and asked them to talk to me about this, I was amazed with the number of people who said, I would not just, yes, I'll talk to you, but I'd love to talk to you about butterflies, about monarch butterflies, about all this other amazing science we're doing about butterflies in general. The enthusiasm was overwhelming for me.
I can imagine. And now, I mean, talking to a lot of scientists and experts, it's obviously, I mean, you travel a lot for this book to do the research, and you also interview people by phone. Tell us about your trips, about those, what did you find? And if there was any specific place that you keep in your memory that helped you the most for your research?
Well, I will tell you a story because, as you know, I don't think this is going to spoil the book for people. At the end of the book, I go to Mexico to see the butterflies up in the mountains. By the time I went there, I had already gone to see butterflies gathering at a number of places along the California coastline. So I kind of felt like I didn't really need to go to Mexico. And there had been a death in my family just before I went, and I thought, maybe I don't need to go. But everybody said, no, go, go, go. And of course, my husband just said, I'll come with you. And so we went, and it was so beautiful. California is wonderful. Where they fly in California, it's wonderful. But we walked up the mountain along a very wonderful trail. It's very well maintained. It's very safe. It's very steep and it's very high in altitude. So I had to stop a lot and catch my breath. But I had an amazing guide who said, don't worry, I will stop with you. And he did. And he didn't push me. I said, I can't go any further. He said, okay. And I said, all right, I'm going to take a few more steps. And he said, great. He's very, very patient man. And we got all the way up there. But while we walked up, we started at 10 in the morning to walk up. It took me a lot longer than it took most people. But while we were walking up, the butterflies themselves had come off the trees and they were flying down in a river of color, a river of sunlight. So I was walking through this river of sunlight, through this amazing, beautiful experience in order to get up to where the rest of the butterflies were. And it is unbelievably beautiful. It was, I do travel a lot, and I've spent a lot of time in Africa. For my horse book, I went to Mongolia. I just go places. I hate sitting still. But this was probably the most memorable wildlife experience I have ever had. And I've had a lot. But the color that just flowed past you, you're just entranced. It was a hypnotic kind of thing. As I think I wrote a sentence in the epilogue, I'm one with the butterflies. And I'm not really like that usually, but they were surrounding me. They were flying. The sun was shining. And, over on the right, there was a stream with the glistening in the sunlight. It was just an indescribable experience. People ask me if it's hard to do that. No, it wasn't. We just went because I had meant to go down with a group, but I wasn't able to do that because of family issues that had happened. So we went and stayed in Mexico City and had a guide come and pick us up and take us up there. I did the walk and then we came back in one day. So that's not necessarily what I would advise. It's probably better to go with groups, then you get to meet the people, you have a more full experience. but even if you only have one day, you can still do this, and it will be one of the highlights of your life.
Yes, it is definitely. Although I have to tell you that you were pretty lucky, because I've been, as Jenna mentioned, I've been there several times with reporters, with scientists, you know, environmental reporters or producers, TV producers, and they have to dedicate more than one day. Most of the time, they dedicate 3 days at least to make sure they see what you saw. So it depends a lot on, you know, if you get the sun out, if you're in a beautiful day, you will see them flying. But if it is one of those days, and you never know really, if there's going to be a cloudy day and they just stay in the clusters, which is also a beautiful phenomenon to watch.
It is phenomenal.
You could not, I mean, I've seen a lot of photos where when you see them in the clusters, like hanging from the fir trees of the unveil trees, it's incredible. That
the
is
sheer number of them is impressive. Yes, the sheer number of them. Absolutely.
But then having them flying all over and all over you and close by, that doesn't happen every day. So,
well, perhaps the force was with me that day. Perhaps the force was with me.
Yeah.
So if you remember other experiences that I had, there were also these kinds of amazing, enlightening moments where I remember standing there with, the first time I saw the butterflies on a tree, I was standing there with an older man who had spent his life, a scientist who had spent his life studying butterflies, and now he was working to preserve these butterflies in this one particular site. I loved the work that he was doing there, and to him, this was the gift that he wanted to leave the world with. Oh. We were standing there talking about that, so of course tears are in my eyes, and then it had been very cold and cloudy, as California can be in the winter time. But all of a sudden the sun opened up, and suddenly, as we were talking about this gift that he was leaving to the world, revitalizing this site, all of the butterflies suddenly started flying all around us. The closest thing that I can use to compare it with is sunlight shining through a stained glass window. But even that isn't really adequate because the stained glass window doesn't move. These butterflies are moving. They're shining and glistening right in your face. And as I was walking up the trail in Mexico, it was not a bit unusual. I wasn't the only one that had to stop. So other people would have to stop, and they would sit in the sunlight and catch their breath. And sometimes the butterflies would actually come over and just sit on their shoulder for a few minutes, so they were covered with these beautiful, beautiful butterflies.
Yes, that's really impressive. Well, now that we are in the topic of the monarch butterflies, there was a question or a topic that I wanted to ask you to talk about is the top colors, because colors is like all throughout your book.
Yes.
And something that I found fascinating is to read about the differentiation they have because of the kind of eye they have that is completely different to ours. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Well, as you know from reading the beginning of the book, my question to myself was, clearly people love butterflies and always have. We have these wonderful stories of Maria Sibylla Merian and the 16, all the stuff. People have always loved butterflies. Why? This is the question that I asked myself. Why? What is it about them that we're drawn to? Because, we're not really drawn to a lot of insects, right? We might teach ourselves to be drawn to them, but it's not an automatic thing that we say, I love all insects. But for butterflies, we love them, and they're closely related to moss, and moss we don't love unless someone teaches us why we should be in love with moss. So what is it about butterflies? And I decided that it was the color. In the beginning of the book, I talk about when I was very young in the 60s. It was a lot of fun to be young in the 60s. One of the things you could do is go to Europe and have no money at all and hitchhike all over the place and pick up money on the way. I think I harvested grapes and I worked in a pub in London and all these things. When I was in London, on one day, I think it was Tuesdays, you had to pay to get into museums, but on Tuesdays it was free. So I thought, I'll go to a museum. And I walked into this museum and I was faced with this huge, massive Turner painting that was just filled with color and light. I'm sorry, I think it was a war painting or something, but I didn't even notice the content of it because this beautiful glistening light was everywhere. And that's, in a sense, I don't want to say it reminded me of being a war, but the butterflies themselves reminded me of that experience where I just had to stop and look and be overwhelming. So I think we are drawn to butterflies because of the colors that they flash. So this is very nice. Our primate brains are evolved to love color, particularly the color red. I think I wrote in the book that when we see red, it's processed in the brain differently than other colors are. First of all, I noticed you have something red right now. So I'm going to look at that and say, red, red, red. But primates love the color red. One theory is that it's because it was evidence of ripeness, or freshness. We want to eat, when grass starts to grow, the tips of it, which are very tender and full of protein and good things, are kind of reddish. Fruits ripen and become reddish. So we love the color red. We pay close attention to it and we want it. We reach out. The babies in the cribs will reach out for something red and they're mobile above them. So we're wired to respond to different colors in different ways. Red is processed in our brains much more quickly than any other color, which I think is amazing. And it explains a lot when you look at art, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're just, when we see something, we go for the red. So that's part of it. I think why we love the butterflies. Talk about red admirals. If you don't know, a red admiral is a wonderful butterfly that just is gaudy with red. I mean, it's just lavish. It just overwhelms you with the red on its wings. And I think that's one reason. So the butterflies themselves respond to those colors a little bit differently, but those colors tell them all kinds of things that they don't necessarily tell us. Of course, we know that they recognize those colors as helping draw them towards mating, for one thing. When I went to Cape May in New Jersey, during migration from north to south in the fall, the butterflies gradually converge into these streams and they have favorite spots that they rest for the night to mate. And Cape May is one of those places. So we went to Cape May and we spent a weekend there and there were butterflies everywhere. Something that was really interesting is that one man was leading a tour and talking to a group of school kids, and he had on a cap that was the same color as the monarch butterflies. And when you watch him walk, he's leading the kids and the butterflies are flying over and sitting on his cap because they're drawn to that color. Here's what we don't know. Does that happen more in the fall than during normal times? Because before migration season starts, monarch butterflies don't gather together. They stay separate and they actually fight with each other quite a bit. They're not particularly nice to each other until suddenly something happens in the fall, which it is apparently triggered by the setting of the sun. The angle of the sun changes some of their biology and they behave differently. And one of the things that maybe changes is their response to these colors that other monarch butterflies have. So during regular times, monarch butterflies have a certain kind of color that warns other predators to stay away from them. So one chapter, which I called How Butterflies Saved Charles Darwin's Bacon, which is Charles Darwin had this weird idea about evolution that nobody believed, well, few people believed in it, but most people didn't believe in it. And someone who was in South America and Central America sent him a paper explaining that if there were poisonous butterflies in a certain area, a certain species of poisonous butterflies in certain area, then other butterflies that are flying there might evolve different wing colors and different wing shapes in order to pretend that they were actually that poisonous butterfly. So monarch butterflies are poisonous. I wrote in there about what happened when a couple of scientists decided they would test and see, and they would actually ate the butterfly, and they found out, yes, they actually are poisonous. So we don't really know what's going on with color in the butterfly's brain, but we can see that they do respond specifically to some of these specific colors.
There is one scientist that you talked to that even mentioned that specifically the monarch butterfly is special because as they migrate, obviously the colors that they are seeing in each ecosystem changes. And yet they are able to continue the flight, to continue the travel and find, the nectar plants that they need to feed themselves. And those colors should be changing. And it says something, I don't remember exactly where, but it says something like they are really clever because they adapt almost at the moment.
Yes, and I'll tell you a story about that. Last fall, yes, it was last fall. I was in Texas in November, and the weather was nice for a lot of the trip, but on one day it was cold and it was rainy and it was not nice. So we had gone to a botanical garden, which we thought we would want to look at, but we didn't really want to walk through the rain. It was kind of hailing, but we went to a place where flowers were there under a kind of a shelter. The whole place where the flowers were there under the shelter was covered with monarch butterflies. They had been migrating, and when it started raining and being difficult for them because they need the sunlight to energize, they all found this beautiful area of flowers that they loved to rest on, to get nectar from. How did they do that? I mean, the thing is, the flowers were under a shelter. That's why they were there, because they want to get out of the rain. But the flowers were under a shelter. And yet all these butterflies that were flying overhead, heading towards Mexico, somehow or other found them.
They found it, yeah.
And scientists still don't know why. There were a lot of things scientists have figured out about monarchs and other butterflies, but there are a lot of things they haven't discovered either.
Yes, and that's fascinating. Talking about scientists, you mentioned, researcher, which I never heard of her before, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce her last name correctly, Maria Sevilla Marian.
Maria Sevilla Marian.
Yes. Can you talk to us about her, because I found fascinating what you find from her and the research that you did from her.
I fell in love. As soon as I read about her, I fell absolutely in love. Maria Sevilla Marian grew up in an area that's now part of Germany. And it was during the era when Europe was still believed in witches. And science was only just beginning to take hold, and many things, many myths, many stories people still believed in. For example, the one that I love the most, many people believe that women could give birth to cats, or, they just believe these things. So actually there was one scientist in South America who was arrested by local people because he brought caterpillars into his house, and then he released butterflies. So the local government decided that he was a necromancer and that he was a witch. And he did escape, by the way. Someone came by and said, no, that's actually what they do. So it was a really difficult time, but Maria, being a girl, was not really allowed to go out of her house and roam at will in those days. This is the 1600s. The males had a lot of freedom, young girls had no freedom, but her mother had a huge garden, and she was allowed to go out into that garden, and she was allowed to explore in the garden. So her family were an early version of modern publishers. Her father put out books, mostly books of flowers that people might want to look, or like catalogs, So Maria's job, even as a young girl, was to draw these flowers and then paint the colors in. So she was very familiar with publishing, very familiar with the intelligentsia of that area. So she began to draw these caterpillars that were on her mother's plants. Then she drew the plants that the caterpillars were on, and she discovered something that nobody else knew at that time, that specific caterpillars would choose specific plants to be on. It wasn't helter-skelter, nature was organized. And then she drew the specific homes that they wove for themselves for their metamorphosis. And then she drew the butterfly that emerged. So she did this for insect after insect after insect after insect. And eventually she had a whole series of drawings that she had of various butterflies and what they ate and what they looked like, what the caterpillars ate, what they looked like when they emerged. And she created a book. So she wrote, and in the book she wrote, it turns out, that's modern scientists talk, but that's what she meant. It turns out that nature is very specific. A specific caterpillar uses a specific plant, and a specific plant will give rise to a butterfly that emerges from the chrysalis, and it will always be ordered. It's not just any chrysalis, it's not just any butterfly. So that was groundbreaking. She published that book on her own. She self-published because, of course, girls don't know anything in the 1600s, so no one would publish her work. So she said, fine, I'll just publish it myself. And she did, and it became a European bestseller. Everybody was fascinated by the book that she wrote, and she became a star. I think she was 32 when that happened.
Wow.
But she continued her interest in that area. And eventually, her story is long and convoluted, but eventually she ended up in Amsterdam, which is a cool place for all of us to go to. And there she met a wealthy woman who had, in those days, people didn't have museums, they created their own museums in their houses. And when people came over, they said, let me show you what I have here. And so this very wealthy woman had, among other things, a blue butterfly like the kind you see on the cover of my book. It was huge, it was blue, it was gorgeous. Maria was in love, but she asked questions about, what does this butterfly eat? What does it do? What does its chrysalis look like? What is its caterpillar? And nobody knew. All they had was this huge, gorgeous blue morpho pinned butterfly that she wanted to know more about. So she said, well, I think I'll just go to South America. And she did. She sold everything. By that time, she had two grown daughters. One was married and one was not. So she and her grown daughter sold everything that they had, and they found passage on a ship and went to South America. And they found their blue morphos, but they also found a number of other wonderful butterflies. And she made the drawings. She got sick there. People think she might have gotten malaria, and nobody's quite sure. She made these drawings. She came back and she created a second book, a beautiful, amazing book with gorgeous art in it. You can buy a facsimile of it online now for $100. I have one and it's really worthwhile. And once again, that was a bestseller because not only was she showing that nature is orderly, but she was showing all these really weird things like alligators, and she was showing bananas, things that people didn't know very much about. I think by that time, some bananas had come back, but they weren't common in Europe. And she was showing how these butterflies and other insects are necessary to pollinate. I don't know if she used the word pollinate, but those things have to be pollinated by these specific insects and butterflies if we're to get more. So by that time, she became really, really famous with that book. Yeah,
well, it's incredible. It's incredible. Her story is incredible, but that kind of times, as you mentioned, that women were not really even allowed to go out. It's
right. She wasn't allowed to go out. She has a personal life that I write about in the book that I won't go into, but she wasn't really allowed to do anything, but she just didn't care.
Yeah.
Her desire for knowledge, her desire to find the answers to these questions was so compelling for her that she didn't pay any attention to social norms at all. That's why she went to Amsterdam. She said, well, Germany's not working for me, really. Everybody's telling me I can't do these things. So she went to Amsterdam, which was even then a very cool place. And then she decided, well, nobody seems to know the answer. They don't even know why I'm asking these questions. I guess I'll have to go to South America to find out. And she did.
What an adventure. What an
Yes.
adventure. My
What
God.
a wonderful person.
A wonderful person. I'm so glad
Yeah.
she did. I mean, she gave us a lot of information that otherwise we wouldn't have found. I mean, I have not seen her drawings, but after your book, I'm going to look for them. I'm sure online I can find something, but it's incredible.
There's a lot online, but you can also buy the second book, the huge book, online. The Dutch Natural History Museum they actually have one of her originals. The originals, intact originals, are very rare, but they have one of the originals and they created a facsimile, so now anybody can have them.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah.
Well, that's incredible. And I've joined you both again. Like Monica, I had also never heard of Maria, but just love hearing about women doing amazing things, advancing science. And speaking of Dutch, Wendy, your book was translated into Dutch, right?
Yes, it was. Thank you for remembering to say that. I was in Amsterdam for a new book that I'm working on last fall. And I went to a Dutch bookstore and they had the book, so.
Beautiful. Well, I love the different cover art too.
It's very different.
But just we have a couple more questions before we close out that I'd love to actually address to both of you. What gives you hope in the face of climate change for the future of monarch butterflies and just insects generally?
Do you want me to answer that? All right.
Sure,
Monica?
yes.
Yes, go for it.
I'm 72. I grew up in a world that was filled with pollution. I grew up in Pittsburgh where the mills roared. I hated going into the city. It was frightening because the mills, I thought we were going into the gates of hell or something. The mills, there were fires all over Pittsburgh and soot. It was difficult to breathe. And in fact, there were some air inversions where people got sick and sometimes even died. And at that same time, there was a river, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, that actually caught fire because
Oh my
there
God.
were so many pollutants there, so much oil. And with that perspective, I see a huge amount of change, a huge amount of caring. When I was in my 20s, people thought anyone who cared about the environment was a nutcase. What do you care about that? Blah, blah. We need to have progress, blah, 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 blah. And no one listened to us in our 20s saying, no, we need to protect nature. But now it's the opposite. Even people who have, well, I won't say that. I'll be careful with what I say. Very few people will say we don't need to care about the environment anymore. Lots of people, it's not a political point of view. It's not just in one country. People all over the world care now about the world that we live in. And the reason I love the monarch butterfly story is that's a symbol of how much people have come to care. This idea that people plant milkweed all over the place. My husband is going nuts. He plants milkweed all over our front yard. We don't have anything but milkweed, but that's all right because we get beautiful butterflies and lots of chaos, fighting. The butterflies do fight with each other. So I see just a basic change in the way people look at the natural world, which is actually, I'm going to be writing more about that in my new book. People have a respect for it now and they care about it. And once you get enough people all around the world, not just in America, not just in wealthier countries, but as you know, Monica, all around the world now, people are caring about this natural beauty. And once you get people to care about it, all kinds of things can happen. I think I wrote one of the things that I liked the most when I went to Mexico for the end of the book was I thought when I walked up that trail that most of the people who would have gone there would have been maybe wealthier Americans who could afford to make the trip. That's not what it was. That walk, it was a Sunday afternoon, and that walk was filled with people from all over the world, particularly local people. I was having a hard time getting up that trail, but I did it. But there was one older man who was there with his family. He was having an even harder time than I was. But the family didn't leave him behind. He wanted to get up there. He wanted to see those butterflies. They would take a few steps. They would stop and wait with him. They would take a few steps, stop and wait with him. And he did get up there and he did see the butterflies. So that to me was a symbol of how much people from all walks of life, from all economic levels, really care about natural beauty. I think I might have told you, I spent a lot of time in Africa. I went there with Peace Corps, and then I went back a number of times. When I first went to Africa with Peace Corps, the environment was mostly something that Westerners cared about. It was still the time when people were write books about the great white hunter, blah, 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 blah. Now, when you go back, it's not the Westerners. You can go there and feel comfortable and safe and love seeing it. But the people running the show and organizing these things are people from the countries themselves. They care about it. They're invested in their natural history and in their environmental future. And that's a change that I've seen happen over 50 years. And I'm just thrilled. I'm just thrilled by it.
That's a beautiful, beautiful perspective. Monica, any thoughts from your work on this?
Well, it's certainly something that makes you think about a lot of things, right? It's not an easy answer. I mean, having hope, definitely. I have hope. And mainly is because I've seen, as I've been in WWF already for 20 years, how coming, to organize local people and local stakeholders, people that is affected or impacted by nature at the site helps really to save stuff. I mean, we have seen in our projects a lot of success in not only in protecting the habitat, but also the biodiversity, how the biodiversity can recuperate if you really take care of it in time. So that's one of our big challenges, that we gotta go, to do things really on time, in time to save them, that we have to continue educating people. And something that gives me hope is, the amount of information and the channels that we have today. As Wendy was saying, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we didn't have social media. If now we can, promote so much what we are doing in WWF, what's happening with the planet, what you can do as an individual just with social media. We couldn't do that 20 years ago. So we have to be wise on how to use those channels. We have to be wise we talk to different kind of people, how we integrate local people, as Wendy was saying, because they are, the owners. They are the ones that benefit the most. So that gives me hope. When I see all that happening in our projects, especially what I saw in the Monarch butterflies, that the local community is so involved and so committed to protect the monarchs for different reasons, that is really a nice way to come back and say, yes, I'm going to continue fighting. Of course, I'm going to continue.
And you know what I love about what you just said, Monica, is social media can make people part of a global movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that means a lot for people all over the world, not just Europeans or Americans, but for people all over the world now, in Africa, in South America, in Central America, all the way over in the Philippines. They can all see that they're part of a huge movement. It's not just them fighting in this tiny little area and being overwhelmed, but they have a lot of support for it. And that really, I'll tell you a funny story. So I went over to cover the endangered species meeting that happened in Kenya years ago. And I went as a reporter, and there were a bunch of other reporters there. And a lot of the reporters that were there were Africans. They weren't just Africans, they were African women. And so, of course, the big issue was whether elephant ivory and whether it could be sold or not. It was very contentious. And so people from a certain country, I won't name the country, but we all know who it is, came and said, it's fine if we, buy ivory and carve it up and sell it. And I laughed my head off, because there were these African women right at the front who got right up and got in that person's face and said, no, that's our ivory. That's our elephant. We don't want to lose them. We want, we want to take care of them. And what I loved about that was the first time I went to Africa 50 years ago, that would never have happened, because there wasn't that young core of committed journalists in the country. Now, those countries have young cores of committed journalists that are indigenous to those countries, and they know a lot more than I do about what's going on in their country. And I love listening to them. So I think that's another reason for hope. People are getting educated in these areas, and if you've ever met any African women, they don't ever have any problem speaking up. They're wonderful.
Well, you both mentioned social media, and not to pivot away from monarch butterflies, but I believe Taff, Wendy, would definitely be a social media star. So before we close out, I just have to hear the story of how your dog has a Harvard degree.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So Taff got an A+ on his empathy test at Harvard. So Harvard, and I am working on a book about this Harvard canine brain program. So I thought, well, as long as I'm writing about these scientists, they're so much fun to be with, I may as well enter Taff. Taff is a border collie, but he's a large border collie, 60 pounds, about twice the size of most border collies. His father was a champion herder and everything, but he's really too big to compete in herdings. But he thought he would come to my neighborhood and run my neighborhood, which he does. So anyway, we found out about the Harvard Canine Brain Program, and we entered. And I said, Taff, would you like to go to Harvard? He said, well, yeah, of course. If I can help them out, I'm happy to help any scientist. So up we went, and they have one test there where he loves his scientist, Sophie. He loves Sophie. Sophie loves him. They took him into a room without me, and they did this test where it looked as though Sophie was hurting herself with a rubber mallet, and she would not really do it, but then she would go, oh, and Taff went over, Sophie, what is wrong? What is wrong? I said, okay, Taff. So she did it again. He ran over the second time. The third time she did it again, he ran over. He said, Sophie, this is too much. And he took the hammer away from her and went over and put it in the corner where she couldn't get at it anymore.
Oh my gosh. Well, border collies, they're so smart.
They are amazing. So what Sophie Barton is her name. She's doing a number of studies about dog brains, but she's doing MRIs of dog brains. And she wants to know if the brains of various breeds of dogs differ. And in fact, she's finding that they do. So he had an MRI there, and he did that test, and they wanted to have a dog star in their online campaign to get more dogs to participate. And so they called and said, would Taff like to come up? And I checked with him. He said, sure, I'll go up. I love helping Sophie out. I'll go up. So he went up for the day, and he made like he was riding in the elevator and doing the MRI. It's all old hat for him now, doing all this stuff. But anyway, we say that he has a PhD from Harvard, and the PhD stands for Pretty Happy Dog.
That's fantastic.
What a fantastic story.
Yeah.
Well, well, thank you so much to both of you, Wendy and Monica, for this conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. For those who haven't already, I encourage you to check out Wendy's book, The Language of Butterflies. And Wendy, we'll be waiting for your next one. I don't want to give it away, but maybe on another creature that flies.
Yes.
But thank you again for those friends who are not able to join us. This will be posted to WWF's website and the Pandas and Prose YouTube page as well. And also, just to learn more about WWF's Monarch work, we encourage you all to go to wwf.org/monarch. So thank you so much again to Wendy and Monica. Yeah, we'll catch up soon.
Thanks for inviting me.
The contrary, thank you for coming. Thank you, Jenna.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. Bye.